presentation.
It is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jan Katzew as our teacher this afternoon.
And it indeed is my pleasure to participate in this webinar experience. My goal with each of the sessions in which I have been involved is more than just to convey information. Indeed, it is my hope and to a degree expectation that each of you will find at least one slide that is useful to you personally, and I almost want to suggest professionally. And when I say professionally, I mean something that you may decide to yourself teach in your own congregational setting and in your own community. The union is here to serve you, and we are very willing, indeed very excited by the prospect of being able to facilitate your use of any of the texts that we are going to be presenting today, or quite frankly in any of these sessions. The provenance, the context for today's session was actually set in a place called Wild Acres, which is a gorgeous camp retreat center about an hour and a half away from Asheville, North Carolina. The last 2 summers, it has been my privilege and pleasure to serve as one of the 2 scholars. They have a Jewish scholar and a Christian scholar who meet together with Jewish and Christian leaders, some of them volunteers, and most of them professionals in their respective religious communities, in an effort to foster and enact interreligious dialogue. This summer, the topic that we focused on were what was really very similar to what we are going to be doing for the next approximately 50 minutes, focusing on texts from our respective traditions that have confounded us, confused us, surprised us, perplexed us, and sometimes even texts that we wish were not there. And as a consequence of the, I almost want to say, epiphany that I kept having in that context, I decided that it would be appropriate and hopefully helpful to many more people to come to terms with some of the difficult, perplexing, and problematic texts in Jewish life. Before we proceed, I would appreciate it if all of you, even if you're on mute, would join me in the bracha and the blessing for sacred study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who has given us mitzvot and has commanded us to engage words of Torah, to immerse ourselves indeed in words of Torah. This very first slide is an excerpt from a Yehuda Amichai poem. And I believe it gives permission to us to study Jewish life in the way that we will be, at least for the next 50 minutes, and I would argue all of us do really all of the time. I filtered out of the scroll of Esther the sediment of crude joy, and out of the book of Jeremiah the wail of pain in the guts, and out of the Song of Songs the endless search for love, and from the book of Genesis the dreams of Cain, and out of Ecclesiastes the despair, and out of the book of Job. And I pasted for myself from the remnants a new Bible. I live censored and pasted and bounded and in tranquility. A woman asked me last evening in the darkened street concerning the well-being or peace of another woman who died not in her time and not in anyone's time. Out of great weariness I answered her, she is well, at peace, she is well, at peace. The first paragraph of this extended poem, from which we've excerpted just a couple of paragraphs, suggests to me, indeed teaches me, that really all of us have, as it were, our own Torah. There may be a Torah from which all of us read that includes passages, even extended passages, that for multiple reasons do not speak to us. And Yehuda Amichai, I believe, is giving himself, and through his poem, giving us permission to not just read the Bible critically through the eyes of literary or historical or spiritual criticism, but to understand that everybody reads a different Torah, so to speak, and each one of us are going to censor parts of the text and paste parts of the text and create boundaries around the text that will enable us, hopefully in the same way that this paragraph ends, to live in tranquility. And we are going to, for the next 3/4 of an hour or so, look at some texts that, in a very personal and sometimes even in a professional way, I have chosen to censor and to leave out of perhaps my Torah. I'm going to stop and ask if there are any questions about Yehuda Amichai's excerpt from the poem Zman.
There are none in the question log, Jan. So we should give people a chance to write if they want.
I see, oh, there was a raised hand, and now it's gone. Janice, okay, it's back. Janice Weiss, you're unmuted.
Yes, I just wondered whether in the second stanza here, in the original Hebrew, was
Yes.
there also, okay.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Were there also two words, as here we see well-being / peace, and the last line, she is well / at peace. Were there
no, that's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. No, in Hebrew, the word is shalom or shloma, her well-being or being at peace. Hebrew, like many other languages, really is untranslatable. Whenever there's a translation, it's an interpretation. So Yehuda Amichai is giving voice, really, to the choir that exists in the word shalom. Shalom can mean so many words and has so many connotations and so many kind of subtle nuances that here he's suggesting that, I mean, how is it possible, for example, that a woman who has died has a well-being? And so there's a suggestion here that there is a conscious ambiguity in the text. One other thing I would say here, and hopefully it isn't too technical and may even indeed be illustrative of exactly the point that Janice is asking us to uncover. Technically speaking, in Jewish life, while a person is alive, you can say to a male, for example, who is leaving, lech l'shalom, go towards peace, or to a woman, lechi l'shalom, go towards peace. You know, be well, so to speak, when you are parting from a friend. The only time, however, that you use a different preposition, a different milat yachas in Hebrew, is after a person has died. The last thing that can be said in certain burial contexts in a committal ceremony is to say lech, not lishalom, but bishalom, in peace, rather, or lechi bishalom. And rabbis, cantors, educators, people who may be conducting a funeral will very often be exacting at that particular moment about the difference between being towards peace and in peace. And that is another part of the what's called paranomasia, part of the wordplay around the Hebrew word shalom that's here. Thank you for that wonderful question. On the next slide here, we have an answer that was given by Abraham Joshua Heschel to classes that he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was not one of those students. I didn't have that privilege to be directly learning with Abraham Joshua Heschel, although due to the voluminous and phenomenal writing that he did during the course of his life, I, and I suspect many of you, have also been among his students. But from people who were his students, they explained to me that very often in his classes he would ask people to respond to the question, what's the most difficult verse in the Torah for you to understand? And very often rabbinical students then and now are wont to come up with very abstruse, very obscure texts, and that apparently was the case in many of his classes. And after listening to his students try to sort of one-up each other, stump each other, and come up with yet a more difficult and problematic verse, he at one point would stop and say to the class, no, I think that the case can be made that the most difficult verse, the most problematic verse in Torah is also the most common. A variation on Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, the Lord said to Moses, or Vayedaber Adonai Moshe, the Lord spoke to Moses, Lemor, saying. The rationale being the idea that God can speak to a person is for everybody, including the greatest theologians in Jewish or any other religious tradition, arguably the most complex, most difficult, and most problematic text to understand. What does it mean? What could it mean that God communicates to a human being? And I guess I heard that probably 25 years ago. And it is, for me, one of the tropes, one of the ongoing lessons in Jewish learning, that none of us should take for granted or skip over what may seem to be sort of a benign or incondite or in some way meaningless text that is almost like or somebody who is just trying to think of what to say and then finally says something. And so that even a phrase such as Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, the Lord said to Moses, can and should be one that deserves our attention, and that we not gloss over it and assume that it is merely a trope that recurs throughout the text. And I think that for all of us, one of the more worthwhile adult learning contexts and texts that we may ever encounter is involving having people wrestle with the construct or the concept of God speaking to a human being. The other text that is on this page is the locus classicus, the basis for what some have interpreted as the anti-homosexuality that is embedded in the Torah. Ve'et zachar lo tishkav mishkaveh isha to'eva hi. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence, or often rendered an abomination. Now, as you may imagine, and some of you don't even have to imagine, some of you already may know, literally volumes have been written in an effort to try to make sense of this verse. For me, Yuda Amichai is liberating. This is one of the verses that, for me, Jan Katzew, both the person and the teacher, and the student of Torah simply wouldn't be in my Torah. This is not a concept that is at all resonant with or corresponds to or in any way can function as a value added to my personal understanding of Torah. And I use this here not to be overly self-disclosing, but to reify, to provide a concrete example for what Yehuda Amichai in that initial paragraph from the poem that we excerpted was seeking to suggest, that each of us really does have permission to read the Torah and say that particular sentence or that particular story simply does not belong in my personal Torah. Here we have a slide that depicts part of the Birkat Hamazon. Interestingly enough, and perhaps trenchantly and tellingly, in most of the versions of the Birkat Hamazon in the Reform movement, this paragraph is left out. And I would suggest to you that the rationale for its being left out is in between both the verse in Hebrew as well as the one in English, actually from the book of Psalms, that has been bracketed by an asterisk. In the English, it is rendered here, I have been young and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous so forsaken that his children were begging for bread. You may have heard it something in people singing Birkat Hamazon, something like this. Na'ar hayiti gam zakanti velo ra'iti tzadik ne'ezav v'zaro mevakesh lachem v'zaro mevakesh lachem v'zaro mevakesh lachem v'zaro mevakesh lachem. So even if you perhaps had not known the English, you may have heard something like that or a variation of it rendered when people are singing the Birkat Hamazon. There are some people, and perhaps some of you on the phone, who when it comes to this will, instead of reciting the words, simply do it on la. And again, this is, for me, a prominent example of a verse, in this case, as I said, from the book of Psalms, that has been selected for Birkat Hamazon, that simply does not comport with my reality and doesn't make sense in the world in which we live. The idea that a righteous person is never forsaken, or his children or her children will never be begging for bread. There are those who read this in a messianic construct, suggesting that one of the ways that Hebrew can be read is sort of in the eternal present, and that this is therefore not descriptive but prescriptive of a world that we would wish to live in, rather than descriptive of the world in which we do live in. And there are many ways in which the mind can play tricks with the text and have it, as it were, comport with our reality. And indeed, I have great respect for those who are able to participate in that type of spiritual as well as mental gymnastic event. Nonetheless, I think that it's important to note that throughout Jewish life, and this is one example from Birkat Hamazon, there are opportunities for us to look at the Torah that is being expressed and figure out how we can relate to it, whether it makes sense to us, comports with our reality, whether we can sing it or not, and how we can both be true to ourselves as well as true to Torah. Here's another example.
Comment.
Please.
We have one that goes back to the Moses text, which was from Peter. So Moses is the only person God spoke to face to face. Am I correct? All others were in a vision or a dream or via an intermediary.
Well, somebody's been reading Maimonides. So yes, yes, and yes. One of the joys, not only on this webinar, but being a teacher of adults and a student of Torah, is that all of us on this call could do a webinar, maybe not this exact webinar, but could be a teacher of Torah. And I hope that in many other settings you allow yourself to both learn and teach Torah. In terms of Moses, there is and has been probably since Moses a political agenda to have Moses be first among equals among the prophets. In particular, since the advent of Christianity and then Islam, there were sociological and cultural reasons why there was a desire to have Moses, as it were, stand above others in the pantheon of prophets. And one of the ways that is done, and we sing it in like Yigdal, for those of you who are familiar with that song, typically sung at the end of services, say on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, as well as many other Shabbatot. And it comes from, in many ways, the Maimonidean dogma that we'll get to perhaps a little bit later in this call, in which he argues that the singularity of Moses as a prophet needs to be a fundamental principle of Jewish life. But in part, that is a response, as I was alluding to earlier, adumbrated by suggesting this is a response in some way to both Jesus and Muhammad, saying, no, there is no seal of the prophets. Moses is the greatest of the prophets. And we read at the end of the book of Deuteronomy in particular, the last 13 verses, which have been recognized at least since the 11th century as being highly problematic, because those verses were written after Moses died. And one of the questions is, well, okay, how did this happen? If the Torah is written by Moses, did Moses, as it were, did his hand work after he died? And one of the ways that the rabbis explain this is that no, he was still living, and he wrote the last 13 verses with a tear, etc. And those verses contain the most explicit statement in the Torah of Moses' uniqueness, in which Yida'o panim el panim, that only Moses knew God face to face, and that there was no other prophet like Moses. From that excerpt of Torah, Maimonides and others have made the claim that you are suggesting, and that all of the others knew God through a vision or through intermediaries, or were asleep, but didn't have the aspaklaria mehira, the clear vision, the clear mirror, the clear lens that enabled Moses to see and to know God intimately in a way that others from Moses until this day have not known, and the rest of us therefore only come to know God indirectly or through cloudy lenses, through occluded lenses, so to speak. Ochela, was there another question?
And then there was another comment from Lori, who said, so these, going back to the second text from Birkat Hamazon, so these words don't have to be taken literally. Think spiritual bread and spiritual starvation.
Yafeh, absolutely. I mean, we can and we should give ourselves permission to find meaning in texts in every way possible. And it is perhaps only in the extreme that, again, going back to you, to Amichai, that we have to circumscribe a text and say, okay, I've tried, and we still may come back to that in various points in our life. We can say, I've tried to make sense of this. At this time, it does not cohere with my Torah, with my understanding of what it is to be a Jew, or my understanding of God or Israel or whatever the text may be. But absolutely, these texts are subject to spiritualization. And Maimonides, as well as many others, have argued not only are they subject to it, but they need to be spiritualized. So that, for example, when the Torah speaks of, and more than once, of having a circumcised heart, and that is a prerequisite, so to speak, for having Yirei Elohim, fear of God. No one, I hope, would read that text and say, oh my God, every Jew, therefore, must, in order to follow the mitzvot, follow the commandments, must have open heart surgery. That would be not just a ridiculous reading, it would be a misreading. That is a text which has a pshat, which has a superficial understanding of a metaphor. And so absolutely we need to read, when the right hand of the Lord doeth valiantly. Hopefully we don't have an image at that particular moment of an enormous right hand doing something that's valiant, but that we are choosing to interpret this in an allegorical or figurative fashion.
Then I think we're good to move on.
I'm sorry?
I think we're good to move on.
Yes. Okay. This is a text that the Reform movement excerpted out of its Siddur and out of its Machzor, out of its both daily prayer book and its high holiday prayer book. It'll be interesting to see, as many of you know, the Reform movement is on the cusp now of developing yet another Machzor, a new version of the high holiday prayer book, and who knows, but they may indeed be reconsidering whether this text would be appropriate to reintroduce in some context. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, far from our soil. May it be your will, O Lord our God and God of our ancestors, compassionate King, who restores his children to their land, to have compassion for us and for your sanctuary enhance its glory. Accept with compassion the prayer of your people Israel wherever they dwell. Prior to David Ben-Gurion, there already was and has been in Judaism sort of an incipient understanding of what in Hebrew is called shlilat hagolah, a negation of the exile or of the diaspora, suggesting that there is a hierarchy or taxonomy of locus or of place in Jewish life, and that's why, for example, we may immigrate to the United States or to France, but in Jewish terms we make aliyah, we go up to the land of Israel, irrespective of whether you're moving from Mount Everest or Mount Rainier, you would still be moving up to the land of Israel. So there's a clear example of not geography determining what it means to go up or down, but clearly some spiritual understanding of hierarchy. And here we have a kind of formulaic understanding of why exile exists. Why is it that Jews live and have lived since the Babylonian exile and even before outside of the land of Israel? Mipnei chata'enu, because of our sins. I think you can probably understand why this is included in the Machzor, in the High Holiday prayer book, because of its deep resonance with the concept of chet, of missing the mark. But for yours truly, at least, I am pleased that the Reform movement consciously decided to eliminate or to excise this particular text from the Machzor because it suggests that the rationale, the basis for exile is sins. The converse would seem to suggest because we have done something virtuous, we will return to the land. And for me, at least, the reductionist or highly simplistic equation between sin and exile and between lack of sin and return home is at the very least problematic. As you can see, hopefully with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, the title for this slide was really, and I think we'll leave it at that. For me, As I said, I'm glad that this is not part of the canon in the Reform movement, and it remains to be seen whether it will become such in the next version of the Machzor. I see a hand. Is a hand up?
Yes.
Okay.
Janice, you're unmuted.
Yes. Thank you. In this statement, we were exiled because of our sins, and in the earlier statement that anyone who is righteous will never face poverty, is it appropriate for us to conclude that when the Torah was redacted, that people believed these interpretations?
Well, I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that question. I think that in terms of this particular text, Mipnei Chata'enu is a rabbinic text. And again, I think there is a political agenda. I think that one of the ways in which the Jewish people has maintained a centripetal force, has maintained its communal existence for a period of 2,000 years when we didn't have a place that we called fully bayit, fully home, was to, in multiple ways, explain that reality. And this is one of those ways. So this is a rabbinic text, not a, it's not midoraita. It's not from the written Torah, so to speak. And as to whether the people who wrote it believed it, I assume that they did, but you know, I personally can't know that. I mentioned before dogma, and in terms of prophecy and the singularity of Moses' prophecy. The reason I'm sharing this particular text with you is not necessarily because it's problematic, but because I think it is, for many of us, an unknown text, and I think that it should be known by many more of us. This was not written to be an abstruse text unearthed only by, you know, scholars, etc. This is from, as you can see here, the Mishnah, chapter 10, Mishnah 1. In Hebrew, it's written there, Perek Chelek. Perek Chelek, the chapter called Chelek. And if you know or want to study a profound yet difficult allusion to mysticism in rabbinic thought, Perek Chelek, chapter 10, whether it's in the Mishnah or in the Gemara, in the Talmudic commentary, would be the place personally that I would recommend. Is it easy? No, but I grew up with a father and mother who kind of taught me that anything that's worth it is probably not easy. So I'm not commending this to you because it will be a nice light read, but I am commending it to you because I do think that it is pregnant with remarkably profound ideas. This text is the locus classicus, the basis for the claim that there is a dogma in Judaism. One of the nostrums, one of the kind of common statements with respect to Jewish thought is, well, in contrast to Christianity, we are not a religion of creed, we're a religion of deed. And anything that is so facile, to me, is dangerous. It's not so simple that we can simply suggest that we have no creedal statements in Judaism. Indeed, in some respects, Judaism is replete with creedal statements, but there have been reasons, somewhat like those that I suggested earlier, to differentiate Judaism from Christianity and Islam. This text is the basis, in some respects, for Maimonides, later, and many other medieval thinkers, listing principles or fundamental ideas of Jewish life. And it reads as follows: all Israelites shall have a share in the world to come. As it states, thy people are all righteous, they shall inherit the land forever. Now, that already would, I think, or could and perhaps should yield a great deal of commentary. All Israelites have a share in the world to come because we are all righteous. But the following have no share in the world to come: he who says there is no resurrection, that the Torah is not from heaven, and the Epicurus. Akiva said, even he who reads in the external books, and he who whispers over a wound, saying, I will put none of the diseases upon thee which I have put upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that heals you. Abba Shaul says, even he who pronounces the name according to its letters. So here is the kind of foundation stone, the cornerstone, for a suggestion that, maybe there are certain ideas, not certain practices, certain ideas, certain beliefs that place one, as it were, outside the camp of the people of Israel. No share in the world to come. They are clearly, among other things, trying to justify the suffering of the Jewish people. Remember, this is written approximately 1900 years ago, when the Jewish people had reached, in some respects, its nadir. At this time, it was likely that instead of what we now call the city of Jerusalem, it was renamed by the Romans Aeola Capitolina. So in addition to having no temple, in addition to having basically having the center of Jewish life eviscerated, it didn't even have the dignity of retaining the name Yerushalayim. And after Hadrian and others, the Jewish people had been effectively reduced to nothing, or just about nothing, in the land of Israel. And one of the ways that the people were kept together were by the kind of rabbinic construct that there were beliefs that could function as a centripetal force that united all Jews, irrespective of where they lived. Now, each of these, or many of these qualifications, has a footnote to it, and each of them, deserves an excursus in and of its own. I'm just going to mention a couple of ideas here before we move to the next slide. That the Torah is not from heaven. There are different ideas that relate to the revelation and what it is exactly that God revealed to the people of Israel. Some would claim that there were really only two mitzvot, two commandments, that were left to God to recite, and the rest was entirely written by Moses, that God only revealed the first two of what are most often called and miscalled or misnamed the 10 Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, and that everything else did not come directly from God, but came from God through the intermediary, or through the intercession, really, of Moses. And that according to this Mishnah, anyone who would claim that no part of the Torah is from God would be excluded from inheriting the world to come. And remember how miserable this world was, the Olam Hazeh, this world was, at the time this Mishnah was written. It was a way of seeking to suggest to Jews it's not always going to be like this. Not only not always going to be like this for future generations of Jews, but it's not always going to be this horrible even for you who are alive now in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, because you, in your afterlife, in the world to come, will have an experience that will be vastly different from the ignominious life life of shame that you are living here on this world. The external books, I don't know if any of you have studied at any time the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. You may not even know, perhaps, that you've studied it in some respects. If you've ever looked at the book of Maccabees 1 or 2, then you've looked at one of the external books to which Rabbi Akiva is referring. And if not, then I would highly commend to you at some point in your own studies that you devote some time to one of the Sfarim Chitzoniyim, one of the external books, one of the books perhaps in the Pseudepigrapha or the Apocrypha, those books that were extant at the time the Torah was canonized and redacted and completed, but the rabbis decided would not make it into the primary canon. Here's another difficult text. I don't know if you read it or you skip it in the Pesach Seder, but I wanted to choose something that is from a common text other than the Siddur and other than the Torah. Shvo chamatcha, pour out your wrath upon the nations that know you not. This is a classical text of vengeance that is utilized. As you can see, the Psalms are cited and Lamentations cited as well as part of the Seder Leil Pesach, as part of the Passover Seder, and that it's a reminder perhaps to us that in Jewish life there are limits to compassion. There is no virtue in Judaism that is infinite. Love has its limits in Jewish life. Fear has its limits in Jewish life. And even compassion has its limits in Jewish life and thought. And perhaps this coming Pesach, I know it's quite a while away, you in your own Seder will consider how it is you wish to contextualize this particular excerpt, whether you will read it or skip it. But in any case, hopefully we can be intentional about what it is that we do when we celebrate the single most celebrated Chag, the single most celebrated holiday in Jewish life. I mentioned love just a moment ago, and here is another text from one of the great medieval Jewish philosophers, Rabbi Bachya ibn Pakuda, as you can see here, lived in the 11th century, highly influenced by Sufism. And here it's indicated that he makes a distinction between two types of wisdom. Duties of the limbs, those things that are behavioral, those things that are observable by another person, and those duties of the heart, chovot halivavot, those things that are internal. And among other things, perhaps you can infer this already, his argument is that integrity is the result of a person having toho kivaro, his inside or her inside is like her outside or his outside. That is to say, our actions are in harmony or in alignment with our feelings and our kind of inner understanding. There are multiple ways in which this is expressed in Jewish life, one of which I'm most fond is the idea of tikkun ha'olam, repairing the world outside is contingent upon tikkun hamidot or tikkun hanefesh, repairing the world inside. That it isn't enough just to do one, that while one may be necessary, both are certainly desirable. And the reason in particular why I am excerpting a piece of Chovot HaLevavot here is that one of the things that I know I learned somewhat late or more recently in my study of Torah is that asceticism indeed does have a place in Jewish life. One of the ways that very often Judaism and Christianity are distinguished from one another has to do, well, Jews focus on this world and Christians focus on the world to come, for example. Or another is that, well, our religious leaders, indeed, we not only we encourage them to be married, but classically they have been married, in contrast, obviously, to the celibacy of Klei Kodesh, of Christian clergy. And it's important to note, yes, it is clearly a minority, and a distinct minority, but there has been, nonetheless, a tendency or a minority voice within Jewish thought, in particular exhibited by Bachya ibn Pakuda, that would suggest abstinence and asceticism have their place in Jewish life. Since we have prefaced in the matter of abstinence from the world, and our intention was that the heart should be wholly dedicated to the love of the Creator, blessed be He, and yearn for His will. This is from a much lengthier text, but that suggests the validity of abstaining from matters of this world in an effort to be wholly dedicated to God's focus. I do see there is a hand, and I am going to leave the last few minutes for questions, but I hope you will indulge me and give an opportunity so that we can at least get through a few more of the texts that are here and one final exercise. The next series of texts are founded upon a Mishnah. In this case, it is from Yebamot, from one of the tractates that involve women in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And one of the things that I hope you will find useful at some point in your own learning will be, okay, where does it say something about mitzvot and what women can't do and what men should do, etc.? I want to make it really clear. I am not in any way, personally or professionally, endorsing the Weltanschauung, the worldview of this text. I just think that even when we disagree with something, and maybe especially when we disagree with something, we should know with what we're disagreeing and why. All obligations which devolve upon a father concerning his son must be observed by men, but women are exempt, and all obligations which devolve upon a son regarding his father are incumbent upon both men and women. And all positive ordinances that are bound up with a stated time, shahazman grama anashim chayavin v'nashim turot, that are bound upon a stated time are incumbent upon men, but women are exempted. This is where you may have heard, women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot. This is the locus classicus, Mishnah Zion, Mishnah 7 of Yibamot, and I, at the moment, am not recalling the chapter. I believe it's chapter 2. But at least at the very point you have this text, and it is the basis for the midrash that is, I'm not going to read. You can read it. It was remarkably upsetting to me. I hope it will upset you, or at least perplex you, and wonder what indeed was going on in the mind of Rabbi Yoshua of Siknin. It's an explanation of why it was that that out of Adam's rib Eve was created. You can see that the title for this slide is Message or Misogyny. You can come to your own conclusions. Here's the bracha, the blessing that is in the Orthodox Siddur that we have consciously changed in the Reform movement to Bat Chorin or Ben Chorin, a person, a male or a female who is free to make choices. And I just wanted to indicate here, again, what it is we sometimes stand for and what it is we sometimes stand against. Whenever there is sort of a general comment about Jews are one community and one people, etc., I do think it's important to recognize that the Reform movement, and here is a bit, I guess, of triumphalism, so I apologize not too much for the following kind of jingoistic remark. One of the reasons I am very proud to be a Reformed Jew is that there are certain principles we stand upon and certain principles that we stand against. Here's one that we stand against. We have no interest and no investment in anyone saying who has the bracha that ends with the words, who has not made me a woman. I still think we should know what that bracha is. I still think we should know that in the Orthodox expression of Judaism, there is an alternative bracha, an alternative blessing that women recite. And here I consciously left it as a question. Is this a blessing? Here we have a text that, among others, led a group of scholars to question whether, arguably, after Maimonides, the greatest Jewish thinker in the last millennium, was a bit of a racist. And in order to focus on the problem at the moment of this text, just look at the bottom paragraph where it says, the Chaver. This is a dialogue between the Khazar king, who is converting to Judaism or seeking to understand Judaism, and a member of the Jewish people, Chaver, the friend, the member. Yes, any Gentile who joins us sincerely shares our good fortune, but he is not equal to us. if the Torah were binding on us because God created us, that white and black men would be equal since he created them all. But the Torah is binding because God led us out of Egypt and remained attached to us. For we are the pick of mankind. This is the locus classicus, the root of what for many people is the problematic idea of chosenness in Judaism. And there has been a ton, probably more than that, of ink spilled on trying to make sense of what in the world Yehuda Halevi was thinking and writing and meaning. And for me, this would be also a piece of Torah, wouldn't be in mine. Well, the Reform movement is based on choice. Here is an excerpt, and by the way, this is a repeated excerpt throughout the Talmud. If one who performs a precept without having been commanded to do so receives a reward, then one who performs a precept, a mitzvah, having been commanded to do so, how much more so does he receive reward? And the final comment from Rabbi Hanina is, one who performs a precept, having been commanded to do so, is greater than one who performs a precept without having been commanded to do so. So we should know we can still ultimately and obviously choose differently, but we come from a rabbinic tradition in which choice is actually second to acting under the notion of being mechuyav, of being commanded. And I do think that one of the more important conversations we can have in the process of engaging and understanding Jewish life is our relationship to choice and commandment. This next prayer I'm going to leave for you to read. This for me is one of the more surprising, in a wonderful sense, excerpts from the Talmud that results in a prayer that I believe is not only good enough for God, but good enough for every single person. I'm sharing this grid with you because I believe it is one way that you may, in your own congregational settings or in your own chavorot, engage in Jewish learning. It is a technique, certainly, that I personally have used and found to be extremely helpful. When I'm having difficulty with something, with a text or an idea, one of the things that can be done is to write this text and share it with friends, study partners, other people with whom I'm learning, and have in each one of these 8 surrounding grids, have them write a commentary on it, an explanation, the way they deal with whatever your problem is. And it's a way in which we can make clear that everybody can teach everybody else, that everybody has problems with Jewish or with Jewish texts and Jewish life, and that all of us need to feel open in being able to express those challenges and be open to other people's responses to them. We have an example here, actually from somebody in this group, and when we send out this webinar in its complete form, we will ask for others who participated in this webinar to fill in each of these blanks, and when it's full, we will send you the completed version so that we'll have the problem in the middle and a bunch of different understandings or interpretations around it. This is a text, again surprising, that suggests that much of what we understand with respect to orthodoxy may be a myopic view of orthodoxy. Before we conclude, let's at least take one question.
There is one that's been sitting in the question box. Why hasn't the Reform movement rejected chosenness then?
Well, I can't speak for the Reform movement. I can speak for Jan Katzew. Certainly we've rejected the kind of chosenness that Yudah Halevi expressed. But guess what? We're in the company in this respect of the overwhelming preponderance of Jews, whether they identify as conservative or Orthodox or renewal. Interestingly enough, one of the bases, and I don't know if you've ever had a chance to read any of the work of Mordechai Kaplan, but one of the bases, the founding fundamental principles of Reconstructionist Judaism is the elimination of the idea of Jews and Jewish chosenness precisely because of its problematization, of trying continuously to justify it from the mind of Mordechai Kaplan and others, meant that it should be excerpted, excised, and changed. I don't know if you've ever been to a Reconstructionist service, but I would highly recommend at some point, perhaps when you're doing adult learning, you take a look at the Siddur of the Reconstructionist movement, and you will see that their blessing over the Torah, the first blessing over the Torah, does not say Asher Bachar Banu, does not say God who has chosen us. It says instead Asher Kervanu La'avodato, the God who has brought us near to divine service. That is perhaps the best example of a modern expression of Judaism, of contemporary expression of Judaism, that has consciously excised the concept of chosenness from an expression of Judaism. The Reform movement chose to interpret chosenness differently. What I would ask us to do in conclusion, and again, please be kind enough to do this along with me, even if you are muted. This is the study Kaddish, the original Kaddish, actually, which is recited after having learned sacred texts together. Please join me in the first paragraph on slide 23, which we will read together in English. And with that, I'm concluding. God of heaven and earth, grant abundant peace to our people and their leaders, to our teachers and their disciples, and to all who engage in the study of Torah here and everywhere. Let there be for them and for us all grace, love, and compassion, a joyful life, sustenance, and the hope of your kingdom. And together we say, Amen. A wonderful and healthy secular new year to all of you. Thank you.
Before everybody signs off, I would like to say thank you to Jan for teaching us and guiding us this afternoon. Our next Torah Live webinar will be on January 18th, and our teacher will be Yehudit Werchow, and we're going to be making a connection to Tu B'Shvat through text and study. And then you can sign up on the website. Thank you again, Jan, and everybody have a great afternoon.